When armies occupied towns during World War II, food became more dangerous than weapons. Soldiers could take livestock, grain, and preserved goods without warning. Ration cards meant little when occupying forces decided to requisition supplies, and cooperation often meant starvation later. Across Europe, families learned that survival depended not on what they owned, but on what they could hide. These were not acts of rebellion for most people. They were quiet decisions made in kitchens, cellars, and fields to keep children alive through another winter. Why food hiding became a survival skill rather than a crime. Occupation changed the meaning of ownership. Anything visible could be seized. Families learned quickly that survival depended on concealment and misdirection. Food that looked scarce discouraged searches. Food that looked spoiled was often ignored. Modern preparedness still benefits from this lesson by prioritizing discreet storage and decentralization rather than obvious stockpiles. How grain and flour became the most carefully hidden staples. Grain and flour were essential and easily stored, making them prime targets. Families hid sacks inside false walls, under floorboards, or mixed with animal feed to disguise their value. Today, storing dry staples in plain containers among ordinary household items follows the same principle of concealment. Why potatoes were hidden despite being common. Potatoes were calorically dense and grew easily, making them valuable to occupying forces. Families buried them in gardens under compost, manure, or rubbish layers. This technique preserved food while making discovery unlikely. Modern gardeners can still use buried storage for root vegetables in emergencies. Now, let's talk about how cured meats were concealed in plain sight. Smoked and salted meats were often hidden by hanging them in chimneys, attics, or even among firewood, where they just sort of blended into the everyday clutter, you know. Some families would go so far as to deliberately blacken surfaces with soot, making the meat appear inedible to any prying eyes. This clever bit of strategy really teaches us the value of blending supplies into their environment rather than isolating them. So, why were cooking oils and fats guarded even more closely than meat? Well, fat meant survival during those cold months, didn't it? Butter, lard and oil were hidden in jars buried underground, sealed up in false containers or sometimes disguised as industrial grease. Even today, fats remain critical calories, and storing them discreetly in ordinary containers is a smart way to reduce attention. Sugar, believe it or not, became both currency and contraband. It was rare and, well, highly prized. Families would hide it inside furniture, behind wall panels, or mix it into other dry goods just to reduce its visibility. In modern preparedness, it's wise to store high-value foods in multiple small caches rather than keeping one large, visible supply. So, you might wonder, why were eggs hidden rather than eaten right away? Well, eggs could actually be preserved using lime water or simply kept in a cool spot, which allowed families to save up some precious protein for later on. Often they were stashed away in cellars or even disguised among animal feed. All of this really shows just how important food preservation techniques were, right alongside the need for concealment. Now, when it comes to cheese, It often survived occupation thanks to a bit of clever misdirection. People would sometimes let mould grow on purpose, making the cheese look, well, rather unappetizing to any soldiers who might come searching. Families just knew which foods could handle a bit of neglect without actually going bad. Even today, it's a good idea to choose foods that age safely and don't need constant attention if you're thinking about being prepared. Now, you might wonder why, even with their simplicity, dried legumes were concealed. Well, beans and lentils were just so easy to cook, and honestly highly nutritious. Families would go to surprising lengths to hide them, sometimes in walls, sometimes buried in containers, or even disguised as seed stock. You know, even today, storing dual-purpose food that could just pass as ordinary household material is, still a pretty effective tactic. There's also the clever way preserved fruits and vegetables were hidden, as waste. Jars of preserves, for instance, were sometimes labelled as spoiled or just buried under trash. Families, rather than relying on locks and keys, used deception. It really shows, doesn't it, that concealment often works a good deal better than fortification. So, what do these old food-hiding lessons still teach us today? Well, WWII families survived not because they had loads of supplies, but because they used discretion. They spread out risk, disguised what had value, and did their best to avoid drawing attention. Even now, in modern emergencies, be they economic or environmental, the same mindset is rewarded. Quiet preparedness, in the end, outlasts any visible stockpile. If this guide has, deepened your understanding of how ordinary families survived occupation, go ahead and subscribe to the channel for more WWII homefront survival history and practical lessons drawn from real experience. Share this video with fellow history enthusiasts and preparedness-minded viewers. These stories, well, they matter because they show just how people endured when survival depended so much on silence and knowledge.